Hi everybody, here I am for the second PowerPoint lecture that I'll upload just as soon as I finish. It's almost 6 o'clock on Tuesday, so I'm going to try to get this done in the next 20-30 minutes, and then I'll be making dinner. I'll be uploading it tonight, Tuesday, so hopefully it'll be available to everyone by tomorrow morning. So today we're going to talk about descriptive observation, and I guess I should have put it even in my title, the descriptive question observation, which we'll talk about in a second. So class plan for today. Last week I posted the first online lecture online, first online PowerPoint, so you should have read that by now. It looked at language and field notes. I actually realized when I looked at the readings for tomorrow, Wednesday the 25th, that I had talked about characterizations, sketches, and episodes last week and included it in that PowerPoint, but it was actually in the readings for this week. So I'll briefly review it, but you should have captured it in the readings this week. So hopefully all that will be much clearer after the readings. After, after class last week, we had a discussion via Zoom, which I think was helpful to everyone, and I shared the audio recording of that with the class. At this point, everyone should have sent their proposal to me, and as you'll see in a minute, not everybody has. If you could include the proposal and the Who Am I section together in one document, that will help me in terms of the grading process. So I have received research proposals from Annabelle, Bucky, Alina, Phoebe, Hannah, oops, sorry, I forgot your H, Alfio, and Hadley. I'm still waiting for the others. You really need to get these into me by Friday, or it will simply be too late for them to matter anymore because we'll really be on to other things. I'll get to grading those tomorrow morning, so hopefully you guys will have them back by the time you're watching this PowerPoint. Today, then, we're talking about Spradley's making descriptive observations chapter, actually, and then a piece from Emerson and all from their chapter on writing detailed notes. And once again, we're just going to very briefly review characterizations, sketches, episodes, and in-process analytical asides and memos and so on and so forth. So we're going to spend most of our time talking about making descriptive observations, and this is coming from Spradley's book once again. So Spradley starts out that chapter by telling us that it is entirely normal to feel unsure of ourselves in the first days of field work. And I'm assuming that many of you have questions like, am I observing the things that I should be? Are these things important things? Am I writing too much? Am I writing too little? A lot of what I'm writing about seems really mundane and unimportant, and so on and so forth. I hope in the class discussion we'll be able to talk through some of these questions. As Spradley tells us, however, already at the beginning of his chapter, is that this is normal and each ethnographer will work through these questions and discover the answers to their questions if they stick with the work and continue doing field notes, taking notes and doing observations. So to help you along your way, though, Spradley starts out his book, and we'll start out our own observations with talking a bit about descriptive questions. And I guess the space where we need to start is the last point here on this PowerPoint, is that we always need to be conscious of the fact that we approach a site with questions in mind, and what we want to try to avoid is to not approach a site with a particular question in mind, especially one that's already shaped by the readings or perhaps already shaped by our own cultural context or ideas, right? But with a more general question in mind, which is what's going on here, right? So Spradley starts out that chapter by talking about different modes of observation. And of course, each mode of observation has a different kind of question format associated with it. He talks about moving from descriptive to focused to selective. So we're just on the very first stage, which is descriptive question observations. We will then later talk more about focused question observations, and we won't have too much time to get to selective, so we'll kind of blend the focused and selective. But certainly now the descriptive is going to be important for us. That's what we're going to focus on now. All right. So the question observation is the basic unit of all ethnographic inquiry. Each thing you see and record is influenced by the questions you have in your mind. So you'll gain skill in observing as you gain skill in asking the right questions. And of course, I'm speaking here about gaining skill as an ethnographic observer is about gaining skill in asking ethnographic questions. And in this first instance, when we first move into a field site, asking descriptive questions. Remember once again that the goal of the ethnographer is to capture the daily life and the world view of this particular place. And so we try to go in without judgments and without too many preconceived ideas and really enter into the space with the idea of thickly describing it, right? So Spradley gives a whole introduction to his chapter where he talks about his first forays into a field site that he studied early on in his career, which was the grand jury. And I think he offers an example of 2 pages of notes from his first day, and then discusses, asks us to go back through his notes and look at the kinds of questions he was asking, right? And he says, in the end, you can see from the notes that I took that I was asking very simple questions or general questions as what did I do on the first day? What is the place like, or how was it set up? What were actors doing, right? What were people saying? He says you want to treat yourself as an informant, right? So you and that requires to a large extent describing or being conscious of the fact that we're always describing from a particular point of view. So we talked about this in the last class as well, is that we are always observing from a particular point of view. We spoke about writing from the first person perspective, from the third person perspective, and getting used to the sense that our writing and our observations are always coming from a particular point of view. Here I put, just to kind of spice up these kinds of PowerPoint lectures online, a picture of myself and my friend Jad, and Zhenya is to the left of Jad, here in the field in Ukraine. We worked together on a fieldwork project in the southeast of Ukraine, and I remember having this exact feeling of being in a space I knew nothing about and feeling very overwhelmed and unsure of myself, and having to really go back in a way that I hadn't in many years to descriptive questions. And so when I was invited into a farm to share a meal of borscht, as I was here, coming back to the place of asking very, very basic descriptive questions, which is, what am I doing in this place? What does this place look like? How is it set up? Who are the actors? What are these actors doing? What kinds of activities are they participating in? What is this activity that we're participating in? What are people saying? And so on and so forth. So treating myself as an informant and thinking about how what I'm writing about is coming from a particular point of view and a particular subject position. Now, Spradley in his chapter talks about 2 kinds of descriptive questions, and the first one is that are obviously interlinked, and that we don't necessarily always differentiate so clearly in the field, but we're going to talk about them separately here. He starts with what he calls the grand tour observations. Now, I write here grand tour question observations because we're always remembering that our observations are based on our questions. So what we want to try to move away from are questions that are implying all sorts of pre-established views, whether they're coming from our own cultural background, our own experiences in the city, or the books that we've been reading, and are focusing on gathering thick descriptions. So, in any case, back to Spradley, he says this concept of a grand tour comes from the common experience, for Americans at least, because it would be quite different in France, as those of you who know France know, of having someone show you around their house, right? Or a business place or a school, right? Oh, welcome. Would you like to see the place, right? And they walk you around to the different rooms, and I put a floor plan of a house to kind of spice things up here a tiny bit. So the focus, he says, with grand tour questions is on the identification of major features of a social situation, right? It's the grand tour. Let's go through the major features and see if we can describe them a first time through. Now, Spradley offers 9 dimensions of any fieldwork site, right? Sites or social situations, as Spradley refers to them. Sites have spaces, right? The physical places that are involved, physical or in our case, virtual also, places that are involved in a site. It has sets of actors, people who are involved. Once again, in our case, they may be virtual or people in the sharing the places, physical places we are in. There's activities. Now, Spradley here, as you can see from this list, differentiates between activities, acts, and events. This is 3 different levels of activity. I find it simpler often for the beginning ethnographer to just think of acts, which I actually, in everyday life, I end up referring to more as activities, but just what are the actions that people are partaking in. You can continue to differentiate between activity, act, and event if it's helpful to you, but you can also just reduce it to kind of what activities are people participating in as well, if that's easier. There's objects. What are the physical things present, right, in this environment? We have time. We talked about time already in the first half of class, and certainly time is showing up as one of these descriptive dimensions of a site. How is time organized? What are the sequencing that takes place over time in a particular site? Goals. What are people trying to accomplish in this site? Sometimes that's not necessarily obvious in the first visit. It might become more obvious later. Feelings, emotions, right? What kinds of emotions are felt and expressed? Certainly, goals and feelings might be something we can cue into more readily when we're participants in a particular scene. You could imagine other dimensions as well, such as the senses. We know from some of our earlier readings, that senses might also be a category. But in any case, these are the dimensions that are identified by Spradley. And a grand tour question observation has to do simply with, for example, a grand tour would be, and you see the question format on the right, what are all the spaces or places in my site? And you might write for a while and identify and describe with sketches, for example, the different places, right, that are part of your site. Another grand tour question could be, who are all the actors in my site? Right? And you might do some descriptive characterizations and describe the different actors in your site. Can I describe in detail all the activities taking place in my site on this particular time, right? And you might describe and write some episodes of various kinds of activities taking place, right? Once again, you'll never ask all the grand tour questions possible in the time that we have. If you're doing field work over the course of a year or so, perhaps you get closer. But right, once again, these are frames and question formats available to us to help us write thick description, right? So you can go through each of these 9 dimensions and ask a grand tour question and describe in the next time you go to the field the different activities or the different actors or the different objects, right? And obviously make a choice. I don't expect you to go through all 9 dimensions and describe all the possibilities that would be available in your site. These are here to help you think through your observations. Okay? The other kind of question then that Spradley talks about are mini tour question observations. And this is when you focus in on one particular dimension, so it might be space or actors or activities, and examine in detail different aspects of that, right? So Spradley offers the following example in his book when he's talking about his work with grand juries. And so one of the mini tour question observations was describe the period of, that should read, waiting for the first meeting of the grand jury. What goes through your mind? What do people do? How do they feel, etc. So it's about taking one particular dimension and really thinking through the other possible dimensions and how they're playing out in relation to that first dimension, right? So, for example, for a lot of, since the large majority, as far as I know, of you are working on quarantine or the quarantine city and COVID 19, we could, for example, imagine a mini tour question observation like this. Describe the period waiting in line to buy groceries at the supermarket. You can describe the space, what's going through your mind, right? What might be your goals? Who are the other people there? What are these people doing? And so on and so forth. You see? So it's about training descriptive questions into around one particular activity, and in this case it's waiting in line to buy groceries, or around one particular space, right, etc. Spradley, in his book, now I didn't know what page this is on, but in the chapter that you read, he also gives this descriptive question matrix. You can look through that if you'd like. I find sometimes when I'm just stuck, although I've done this enough now that I usually always have stuff to write. But if you're feeling stuck and you're not quite sure what kinds of descriptions you could be writing, look to the matrix for ideas. In the diagonal here, in the boxes that are darker, where the border line is a darker black, these are the grand tour questions. And you can see, right? Can you describe in detail all the places? That's where space and space meet up. Or for object and object, you see another darkly bordered box. Can you describe in detail all the objects? And then the other questions are various kinds of mini tour questions. If you were going to stay, for example, only in the object line and think through objects in more detail in a mini tour question, you could follow the object line either down or across, and it would give you ideas of other sorts of questions you could be asking. So that just is, once again, it's a reference. It's there to help you think about writing descriptively, which of course once again involves asking descriptive questions. So you can refer to it for help. Once again, don't have to ask all the questions or describe all the things referred to in the matrix. Okay. Once again, as I said at the beginning, I didn't realize last week I discussed with you characterization, sketches, episodes, and field note tales, and I shouldn't have, because you actually didn't have it in your reading, and I was surprised some of you didn't point that out to me, but in any case, I won't say much here. You can refer back to the lecture from March 23rd to hear what I say about it there, and also to see examples, because I actually integrated examples into that PowerPoint. And here I'll just simply briefly reiterate once again. So other kinds of ideas for writing descriptively are coming from Emerson's work. And he's using narratives, he's using other kinds of narrative strategies, perhaps a bit more from creative writing to think through, though of course we're not writing creatively here, we're trying to thickly describe. But in any case, he says, think about the unit of the characterization, right? Here you're characterizing or describing an actor in a context, but you're being very careful to describe that actor in action, right? Going about something in context. I shouldn't be able to cut that characterization out and be able to drop it into any other thick description. It has to be detailed enough that I see that person in the and it may be you as well, in context, in action, in a particular social situation, right? And we want to try to avoid labeling once again. Sketches, which Emerson refers to as the smallest unit of description, I should read description, is usually used for place, and it's sometimes objects, but it's a static snapshot, right? It's like a postcard, an actual drawing or sketch, right? And it's about detailed imagery, about describing the objects in a place, about describing a place in static detail. An episode is recounting action. It moves through time, right? So this one really is, once again, very nice for activities. It can be nice for time sequencing. You can think in terms of episodes. Field note tale you can read about. Once again, this is rather rare, so we won't go into it in any detail here. If you focus on characterization, sketches, and episodes, I think you're already doing a great job. You get a little more detail too from Emerson here about in-process analytical writing. I spoke in the last lecture about analytical language. Spradley tells us that analytical language is one of the 3 or 4 languages that are integrated and present in our notes. Certainly Emerson reiterates this point that analytical writing it should be happening already in the field note, but that it needs to be mindfully kept in its place and not replace descriptive writing, right? So, as Emerson tells us, we inevitably begin to reflect on and interpret what we are experiencing in the field while writing notes, right? Indeed, the process of writing field notes heightens and focuses the interpretive and analytical processes. So while writing, the researcher is often assimilating and starting to understand, right, the various kinds of experiences that they're describing. So to capture these ruminations and reflections and insights, to make them available for the ethnographic report or article or book at the end of the process, researchers pursue different kinds of analytical writing, and these stand in stark contrast to descriptive writing, right? They're complementary, but they're radically different. And they certainly cannot replace the descriptive writing. You need to describe the event or the actor, the activities, or whatever it may be, and then analytically reflect upon it, if indeed you bring analysis into it. Now, Emerson and all identify 3 kinds of in-process analytical writing. I only ask you to write asides. That's what we talked about last time. That's all I think you're capable of at this level of ethnographic practice. But I want you to be aware of the different sorts that Emerson talks about if you're to continue your ethnographic training. Okay. The first one is the aside then, and this is brief reflective bits of analytic writing that try to explain, clarify, interpret, ask questions. Remember, asking questions are an important part of Spradley's process about something that you just thickly described in your notes. As I said last time, please be sure in your notes to mark these with an AA. Sometimes you can put the theme, AA ritual, AA alienation, and then put your analytical thought. Okay, you can put these in parentheses often. That's what I often do. So that I mark it as an aside, right? Once again, I put AA and then potentially a theme so that at the end, when I want to go back through my notes, I can simply search for AA in a simple search, and I find and can actually copy and paste all my analytical asides to a separate document. Okay, so I ask you to do that here. A commentary is a bit more elaborate. A commentary takes a paragraph, right? He calls this an analytical commentary. I said that you could use parentheses when you're writing analytical asides, or that you could use a separate paragraph that once again begins with AA and perhaps a key word, right? Emerson calls these commentaries because they deserve a paragraph, and so they're a bit more in depth. There are memos also, which I'm not going to be asking you to write for this project, but which you can be aware exist. And an analytical memo is usually a concentrated, extended effort to identify and develop an analytical theme while you're still in the field. An analytical memo might take 2 or 3 pages, and it might involve cutting and pasting from other parts in the field notes, right? So it's a sustained moment. Analytical memos often are integrated into notes, although sometimes I do analytical memos, or I call them analytical note cards, and I keep them in a separate document as well. Once again, I'm not going to be asking you to do those, but to know that's a possibility and another kind of in-process analytical writing that ethnographers do. Okay, so next steps. So please, if you can, join the class discussion tomorrow. So it's going to be, you'll probably be hearing this on Wednesday morning, but I'm actually recording it on Tuesday. On Wednesday the 25th at 12:30 Paris time, so for the second half of our class, I'll send out a Zoom email invitation 5 to 10 minutes prior to the beginning, so look on your AUP email for that. Bring your questions, bring your observations for discussion. I really feel like last time we had some interesting discussions about field work in the COVID era and kinds of things to be looking for. And some of the observations were insightful and useful. Students had interesting analytical ideas too. So I'm really hoping we can use that space with whomever can come to kind of think through together some of these things. And of course, I will share that Zoom discussion, the audio discussion with those who can't make it, so perhaps they can at least profit from their classmates' questions and ideas. Okay. Of course, over the next week, I want you to continue your field work, right? Using these ideas discussed in the lectures. The more notes you have, the easier the next steps are going to be, right? Of course, as I said in the last lecture as well, notes will be collected at the end of the semester just so that I can see that they were done. They're not going to be graded, certainly not for content. It's just were they complete or incomplete, right? Try once again to take 3 or 4 days of notes, 4, 5, 6 pages would be great, more if possible. You saw that, I think, in Spradley's example in the descriptive question observation chapter. He has about 2 pages of notes for the first, I think, 10 minutes of the grand jury experience. Certainly, I know in my recent field work in the Jury Terroir, which is a cheese tasting panel, a cheese tasting panel can last 2.5 hours. I tape these, so I transcribe conversations, but I'm also taking descriptive notes. And for 2.5 hours, I have 40 pages of text, actually, of description. So just so you know, you can get an awful lot of description if you put your mind to it. So try not to do a bare minimum. Try to go enough so that you're starting to see patterns and starting to feel patterns in what you're writing. That would really be the sweet spot to reach before the next class, is that you're starting to see repetition and pattern, and you're writing about things and you're starting to get a little sense. For next class, I'll probably ask you to upload before class some examples from your notes, so perhaps I can integrate them into PowerPoints. Maybe examples of good descriptive question observations, examples of sketches or characterizations or episodes, perhaps analytical asides. We can keep those anonymous, for example, but I'd love to start sharing and really get into a more in-depth conversation for the following class next week. And next week we'll start to do what we call domain analysis, and so we're going to start to look for patterns. And the way we're doing, and we're going to start to then talk as well about selective observations. So really make sure you have quite a nice stack of field notes before we start to talk for next week's lecture. All right, that's it. So I'm going to stop here and upload. Thanks.